I did it! It's done!
Godt, det var fint. Og kvarter så har jeg kaldet.
Nasty. Altså sådan en moderatormøde nu, som er færdig hvornår?
Ja, kort kl. 5. Ja,
Eller så underholder jeg dem bare.
Men det er sagt, at det går lidt tidligt. Jeg forstår godt, hvorfor ordet lækker. Både på mere og med. Så skal vi bare have dig i noget sådan lækker...
Malergryden.
Ja.
Jeg kommer ud siden af gryden. Enough for two?
Spicy and mommy.
Yes. Perfect serving size for 2 men. Ow!
Sugar puppets. Ja.
Vil du have lidt pudding over? Nu skal vi på restaurant eller alt muligt. Kom, det er sådan. Og så kan du gætte. Er du klar til dit møde? Jeg kommer til at møde op til frisøren i morgen med the nastiest hair nogensinde. Fordi jeg ikke vasker det. Men det er ret dejligt, fordi så behøver jeg ikke at vaske det. Fordi der er bare some guy called Christopher, der gør det for mig. Ain't that nice?
Ja.
Cute, dit hår er sådan helt lyst. Fordi folk var lidt. Så ikke sådan, at man lægger meget mærke til det. Men lidt. Jeg er så øm på min miljøsatik. Smuk i dag. Skal jeg lukke her så?
Ja.
Hello, my dear. On WhatsApp.
As the last of the bugs leave their homes again, and I'm spinning around down the middle for a minute. The world seems so simple. Feel the rush of my blood, 17 again. I am not scared of death. I've got dreams again. It's just me, the curve of the back, and there is me around.
Sounds lovely. Hope you're having a lovely time in Norway. For the data, yes, let's chat. I'm going to... sorry, paused and then forgot what I was saying in the middle of the sentence. I'm going to Scotland on Thursday, so this week is a bit mental, but maybe next week we could meet and have a chat if you're around. On the motion capture data, that might not be a problem, because what I'm thinking of doing as an initial analysis on the salsa data is using like the center of the person. So I could, in theory, if I'm doing the same thing with the Lindy Hop data, which may or may not be a good idea, we can discuss, and also I can have a chat with Morten about it, and also, you know, run it on the salsa data and see if we see anything. So many steps, many things, but like could literally just take an average of the hit markers and that would be fine. So long as, you know, gap filling's done and stuff. So yeah, so that could be a way of making it work, and also not necessarily an issue to have quite short amounts of data, because also for the salsa data, I'm currently doing it on just the specific steps where they're told to do specific steps. And some of those are actually quite short, like 40 seconds to a minute and a half, but there are like 240 of them. So I feel like it's probably going to be okay because, yes, they're short, but there are so many. I'm guessing we have less for the Lindy Hop, but I don't actually know. Yeah, I should probably also just have a meander around the data. Yeah, and yeah, of course, also all the questionnaire stuff. Definitely something could be done with that as well. Yeah, kind of just want my 3 papers. I'm doing my best to not be fussy at this point. I'm not sure about using the phenomenological stuff myself because it's a bit further outside of my area of expertise. But definitely would also, like, regardless of that, would love to just hear more about it and hear about like what's going on with it and how much we have and ideas of things we could do with it and all of that. And yeah, no, I'm feeling so much better. It's been a pretty steady increase in state of health since I moved back to the UK, really. Mental recovery is still lagging physical recovery.
Hello, Gunnar, and hello, Luca.
Hello, hello, nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. I'm Peter. I'm your host today, so my job is to try to make you feel as comfortable and welcome as possible.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. And I think one thing that's nice to do before the others arrive is just to check that the screen sharing and all of these things.
Oh yeah, I can check now. That's a good idea. Okay, can you see my slides?
Let's see. Currently, it's a black screen. Yes. What is an artifact? Active Inference and technology.
Okay, great.
Very exciting. And do you have videos or sound or something like this, or just
no, it's just a presentation.
Good. Then everything should be perfectly in order. And I have noted that we would record this meeting, but not put it online.
Okay.
So then I can just send you the recording afterwards if you would like.
Oh yeah, it would be nice. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it can be used as notes.
Oh yeah, just for processing and
Yes.
yeah, that's some notes.
Perfect. And I suppose your name should be pronounced something like Luca Possati?
Yeah, it's
not
perfect.
horrible.
It's perfect. It's no worries.
Good. Yeah. And I'm Peter, by the way.
Okay.
Because it doesn't say my name because we're using the. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I see.
Yeah. So sometimes it's nice just to know the first name. Hello, Tialin.
But I think I read one of your papers.
Okay.
On active inference. So.
That's flattering. I mean, the one with whatever. That's.
I think the last one, the most recent one. I think maybe I'm wrong, but the one about collective active inference.
Yeah. I hope you liked it.
No, absolutely.
Okay, it was nice to write at least. Okay. Relevant, of course, to human technology interaction.
Sorry?
It's relevant, of course.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like, at least I find this fascinating, this being one thing together and not being like
you
when
mean
you're
collective systems. So yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Well, if I understood correctly, it's a new trend in the active inference literature. I mean, focusing on, there are a lot of papers now about collective intelligence and collective active inference.
More and more, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of built into the framework that this is a path that makes sense to go, I think. But still somewhat, at least at the time when I wrote this paper, somewhat underexplored, like in terms of, at least in terms of simulations and so on.
Yeah.
Hey, Andrew, good to see you.
Hello.
And I see you have a large audience today. That's always nice.
Really?
Yeah.
I don't like large audience.
No. Well, we will turn off the screen so you can pretend they don't exist. And as usual, you present, and usually people take 30 to 45 minutes, and then we'll have some discussion, and then Carl will summarize and in the end.
Yeah. I counted 30, 35 minutes. It's okay.
It's not so strict. It's mostly a target, I suppose.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. Then I don't think I had any other things that I just wanted to check with you in my head. And I'm sure Carl will be here in just a few minutes. Yeah, usually at least. Where may I ask where you are physically?
I am in the Netherlands. I work here in the Netherlands. I'm from Italy, but I work in the Netherlands.
Where in the Netherlands?
In the Netherlands, the Enschede. It's the University of Twente. It's at the boundary with Germany.
Yes. Okay. I have not. I've been a few times to Netherlands. I'm from Denmark.
Okay.
And there's some collaborations and so on, but not to this specific university. There are so many.
Yeah. I suppose you were in Amsterdam.
I've been in Amsterdam, Groningen, Eindhoven, Tilburg, a bunch of, but not this one.
Yeah. Previously, I was in Delft. I started my position here in Delft.
Yeah. Exciting. Yeah, Eindhoven is where the RX Infer group who makes...
Exactly. There is Eindhoven is there is Bert de Vries.
Yeah, exactly.
He's working on active inference. Absolutely.
Yeah.
They do very technical things.
Yeah. I also like this about the field, that there is quite a breadth from these technical
more
people.
Theoretical, philosophical,
exactly.
And more application. Yes.
Yeah.
Even if it's quite confusing sometimes, so you don't find where to go.
It's certainly also a challenge, I would say.
Yeah.
Also, just that engineers have to work with philosophers and neuroscientists. That sometimes even the terminology, way of thinking is hard to.
But I think they are completely two completely different mindset.
Yeah,
humanities and social science, and then engineering, and completely different. So it's a challenge.
Yeah. But also, I think part of why I like it, it's inspiring that there are so many positions represented in the same field. But what is your background, if I may?
Well, I have a background in philosophy. I'm a philosopher of technology, but also in psychology and psychoanalysis, more specifically.
Interesting, yeah.
Indeed, I met active inference through psychoanalysis.
Maybe Mark Solms or some of
also, but for me, a big turning point was 2014 paper called The Entropic Brain by Robin Carter-Harris.
Of course, yeah. Is this specifically contextualized with psychoanalysis as well?
Yeah, because there are many different connections between that in that paper. The authors pointed out many different connections between free energy principles, psychedelics, and psychoanalysis also.
That's very exciting. Yeah,
it's a field. Absolutely, there is a growing literature about the connection between free energy principle and psychoanalysis.
Yeah. So many things to read and so little time.
Exactly.
I can see that Carl is here. Hi, Carl.
Hi there.
Before we start, I should just say that I will have to leave, unfortunately, at around 5. So it may be that I'm not able to personally give you the last round of applause. So if that's all right with Carl, I might hand that last ceremonial gesture over to you at that time.
We'll make sure that we finish before 5, and then you can do the final Master of Ceremonies.
Okay, perfect. That's also a good solution. Well, then there's nothing else to say except that it's a huge pleasure to present Luca Possati here, who will present on the relationship between humans and the technology they use within an active inference and free energy principle framework. And I'm looking forward to the talk. We'll do a presentation. There'll be some time for group discussion, and then Carl will summarize. Okay.
Well, thank you so much. Can I share my...
Yes, go ahead. And I will keep an eye on the chat in case anyone writes anything, but there will be time for discussion after the presentation.
Okay.
Also.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you so much for this opportunity to share my research. My name is Luca Possati. I'm a researcher and lecturer at the University of Twente in the Netherlands. My research field is philosophy and psychology of technology. First of all, a general caveat at the beginning. All these hypotheses and arguments I will introduce, I will present during this contribution is just a work in progress. I'm still working on these materials, so please give me as much feedback as you can, because it really helped me better understand what I'm doing and where I am going. So, first of all, what is my objective in this presentation? Well, I would like to better understand whether and how active inference and the FAP can help us make sense of human-machine interaction, human-technology relationship. Especially, I would like to bring the FAP and active inference into these 3 domains: sociology of technology, the psychology of technology, and by extension, design. And this also because I think that incorporating the FAP into technology studies and the social sciences can add fundamental values across these 3 naturally interconnected areas: sociology of technology, psychology of technology, and design. This also means that I do not plan to apply the FAP and active inference to a single technological domain, for example, artificial intelligence or robotics. Instead, I will use these theoretical frameworks as methodological approaches for grasping the general problem of human-machine interactions, and basically for addressing some fundamental and philosophical questions, such as what is an artifact? Why do humans need technology? And what is technology in relation to human life? So this also means that I do not talk primarily to technical specialists, but to social scientists interested in integrating active inference and the FEP into their methodology. This also means this involves the challenge of reframing the FAP in less technical terms, making it more accessible for a non-specialist audience, without dumbing it down, of course. Now, first of all, a general framework, general outline of my argument. My argument is organized in 2 parts. The first part is more theoretical, the second part is more practice-oriented, design-oriented. In the first part, I will claim that active inference and the FEP offer an elegant, parsimonious, and most importantly, physics-based theoretical framework for justifying the extension, the attribution of agency to artifacts, to machines, to technology. And the question of machine agency is a crucial issue in both technology studies and design. This means that our conception of design radically changes depending on the way we answer this question. We solve this problem relative to the attribution of agency to artifacts. Can we attribute agency, full agency, autonomy to artifacts, robots, technology, artificial intelligence. I think that active inference and the FAP give us a highly flexible and physics-grounded notion of agency, one that can be extended to artifacts as long as they possess a genuine Markov blanket. This is very interesting from a philosophical point of view because it opens up a rich dialogue with many different trends in the philosophy of technology and sociology of technology. For example, Bruno Latour's actor network theory, new materialism, object-oriented ontology, and many others. In the second part of my argument, I will focus on the notion of design. Basically, my aim is developing, at least drafting, a kind of active inference-based methodology for design and design thinking. So if we accept the premises lie out in the first part of my argument, then design can be understood as the act of creating, assembling, developing new forms of agency. That is, new Markov blankets and generative models. Of course, what does it mean to create Markov blankets? How can we rethink design from the FEP perspective? These are the main questions I will address in the last part of my talk. Anyway, let's start setting the stage and establishing a general terminology as a starting point. Well, first of all, what is an artifact? A generic definition can be an artifact can be defined as any material product of human action, from straightforward items like hammer, eyeglasses, notebooks, to intricate composite systems such as brain-computer interfaces, skyscrapers, satellite networks. This idea echoes Aristotle's distinction between things brought into being by human agency and those arising through natural forces. Artifacts are created intentionally by people. We can call them designers, inventors, whereas others, objects and structures, form independently in nature. Artifacts are inherently for something, meaning they serve specific functions. Typically, an artifact's function is defined by the effects it produces in the world for its user. So, for example, a hammer drives nails into surfaces, glasses sharpen our vision, maps help us navigate, guitar enables us to make music and express our emotions and feelings. In most cases, these tools are deliberately designed and manufactured with a particular purpose in mind, a particular goal, a scope, a task, what we might call their proper functions. A design intentionally created that artifact with a scope, with a task, with a specific function. However, we also often repurpose artifacts in ways their designers never intended. So, for example, a hammer can become a weapon, a guitar can become a decorative piece. In short, artifacts are functional entities, whether intentionally crafted or creatively repurposed, that produce effects in the world for their users. Now, as I said, the question about whether artifacts deserve recognition as autonomous agents in social change, or whether agency belongs exclusively to humans, sit at the heart of technology studies. However, it remains quite unclear and unresolved. Many scholars argue that what looks like an artifact's property or power really boils down to human choices and interpretations, leaving no need to ascribe genuine agency to non-human things. So there is no space for non-human agency. In contrast, a large body of literature in philosophy of technology and technology studies, what we call in general science and technology studies, a large body of this kind of literature clearly demonstrates how a technology's design can significantly influence behaviors and drive social change. There are many different examples of papers, classic papers in the philosophy of technology, demonstrating this point, think about, for example, Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour, in many different papers, shows how everyday objects like seat belts and hotel keys can nudge users towards specific behaviors, specific attitudes, specific habits or disposition. A very simple example is the hotel key with its large heavy fob. It is designed so guests are more likely to return it to the front desk when they leave their room. So in this case, as you can see, the design of this technology effectively dictates the social structures required for their use, specific disposition and habits. Now, in the literature, we can distinguish two different positions. Of course, I'm oversimplifying. We can take these two different extreme positions. They both share the idea that artifacts and things go far beyond merely affecting what we do. An artifact is not just a bunch of functions. It also influences our worldview, our experience, the way we perceive our environment, the way we interpret our environment, and our culture, our cultural heritage. So according to the strong view, there is no distinction, no ontological or epistemological distinction between human and non-human agency. We have to put humans and non-humans on the same footing. This position is exemplified again by Latour and actor network theory. Actor network theory is a specific methodological approach in science and technology studies. And according to these scholars, we can talk about a symmetrical or flat ontology, in which agency is distributed equally among humans and non-humans. This means that, for example, Latour talks about collectives, hybrids. It doesn't talk about humans and non-humans. We have hybrids. We have collectives composed by a network of humans and non-human agents. Therefore, agency is attributed to this network and equally distributed among humans and non-humans. According to the weak view, there is a distinction, a radical distinction between non-human and human agency. This is more represented by post-phenomenology, ecological psychology, classical phenomenology, certain kind of anthropology. According to this view, artifacts, of course, they shape our perception, our experience. They can change our mind, but their agency depends on human agency. So, for example, the laptop can change radically the way I work, but that kind of agency, that kind of influence is based on human intentionality, on human agency, and can be reduced to human agency. Now, my thesis is that the FEP offers a simple theoretical model for addressing the question of artifact agency or machine agency, striking a balance between the two extreme positions just mentioned. My argument is as follows. First, from the FAP point of view, agency is essentially self-evidencing and depends directly on the existence of a Markov blanket. This means that self-evidencing can be seen as an emergent property of any random dynamical system endowed with a physically meaningful Markov blanket. However, this does not mean that there is only one kind of agency. Agency is more a spectrum. This means that the depth of an agent's agency depends on the architecture of the Markov blanket and the associated generative model and prior beliefs. And I think this is in line with the paper on the strange particles. From this point of view, full agency is not mere the execution of physical movements, but the existence of probabilistic beliefs about one's own actions, beliefs that are formally embedded in the agent's generative model and optimized via free energy minimizations. This means that full agency involves having a vision about the future, having a vision about, the fact that the agent has a vision about its own future and is able to act according to that vision. And this implies a certain form of control, planning, counterfactual reasoning. Now, think about a rock. It neither melts nor crumbles. It remains unchanged, but I can see it. I can feel the rock. I can perceive it. So there is a Markov blanket. The rock is an example, a perfect example of inert particles. There are no active states. I'm referring here to the categorization included in the paper on strange particles. So the rock possesses a generative model. The generative model is basically composed by Newton's laws and sensory likelihood, but it possesses a free energy minimization. At least we can hypothesize. We can hypothesize a certain free energy minimization. Internal states minimize variational free energy via gradient flow. However, this minimization cannot be directly inferred from behavior because, by definition, as I said, there are no active states to make it manifest beyond the blanket. So there is an internal self-evidencing. It's a very basic form of agency. There is no temporal death, no choice, no planning, no certain kind of control over future states. Instead, if we consider more complex systems, such as plants, tiger, humans, so animals, we have different Markov blanket architecture, different generative models, different forms of self-evidencing. We have conservative and strange particles, sensory and active states, more abilities. This is basically the idea of strange particles. There is a shield between internal and active states, and thanks to this kind of shield, the agent can have beliefs on its own actions. But what happens if we have a hammer? What makes it different from a rock? What sets it apart from a rock? Well, what makes the hammer different is its coupling with a human user. On the one hand, together with the hammer and the human form a new Markov blanket with a new generative model and new priors. On the other hand, in order to couple, to be associated with the human user, the hammer must possess some specific physical properties, a certain kind of material or a shape or certain kind of resistance. These specific physical properties are based on the designer's generative model, are based on what we call the blueprint. There is a designer who established specific physical properties that the hammer has to possess in order to couple with the human user. And what if we consider even more complicated artificial systems? This is the point: architectures of Markov blankets, engineering Markov blankets, fusion and connection of Markov blankets, and also what we can call the generative capacity of Markov blankets. The fact that if we connect different kind of Markov blankets, we can create new Markov blankets with new generative models. Think about this. This is attitude determination and control system. It's a specific kind of artifact. It's a vital spacecraft subsystem that establishes and maintains a spacecraft orientation in space. It's essential for space navigation and space orientation. It's a vital part of any kind of spacecraft. Now, this device can be perfectly described as a conservative particle with external states, internal states, active and sensory states. With low noise and an accurate model, the internal states follow near least action, while actions realize those predictions, and the two are cleanly shielded from each other by the sensory blanket. Internal states update only through measurements, and their effects reach back inside only after passing through the environment and sensors. So it can be it fits perfectly the idea of a conservative particle, and therefore it's this specific kind of agency. But what about another kind of device like WhatsApp? What is WhatsApp? Well, we have two options here. On the one hand, we can see WhatsApp as just the app in my device. And here it's quite simple. The touch screen can be seen as a Markov blanket. We have sensory state, user inputs. We have active states, outputs, so notifications, software updates. If the app is based on artificial intelligence, even more. We have external states, the users, and we have the internal states, the code, the softwares. Now, this is one way we can describe WhatsApp as a kind of conservative particle. But what if we consider WhatsApp as a planetary infrastructure? WhatsApp is not just an app in my device. It's an app that runs through billions of devices. From this point of view, we have to think of WhatsApp as a multi-layers system, a set of different kind of active inference agents, designers and engineers, software, hardware, platforms, users and devices. So we have a macro system composed of group of active inference agents at different temporal and spatial scales and with different generative models, interacting synchronization and free energy co-minimization processes. But the system in itself is not an active inference agent, it's more a dissipative particle. Now, let's take stock before moving to the second part of my presentation. I said that I claim that the FEP gives us a strong physics and information theory based reasons to attribute agency to artifacts, provided there is a specific informational flow, a specific set of conditional independency, a structure, a Markov blanket. This means that the real conceptual advantage active inference gives us to think about thinking about technology is a non-anthropocentric and ethically neutral model of agency. This is also important because it gives us a conceptual advantage for reformulating some philosophical concepts that we can find in philosophy of technology, sociology of technology, and even in design, such as technical mediation, multi-stability, symmetrical ontology, design thinking. Second point, by offering a basic model of agency as self-evidencing, so the idea of spectrum, the FEP let us avoid unrestricted panpsychism, drawing clear distinctions between mind and agency, as well as between life and agency. Now, let's move to the second part of my argumentation, which is much more focused on engineering Markov blanket, inferior boundary engineering. Of course, as I said at the beginning, all this is very hypothetical. That's why I put a question mark in the title. Anyway, my argument is as follows. If artifacts exhibit more or less sophisticated agency depending on the architecture of their Markov blanket and therefore the complexity of generative model, then the design and the use of an artifact can be understood in two senses. First of all, design can be seen as creation, assembly, and development of new Markov blankets and their associated generative models. Secondly, artifacts can be seen as forms of co-agency, in which the agency of the human and that of the artifact of multiple artifacts used to construct or use other artifacts converge and synchronize to jointly minimize free energy. Of course, what do I mean here by design? Very basic form of design, product and service design, how we can design and build specific products, specific services connected also to architecture and interior design. How can we use active inference in order to improve our way of designing products? Now, I refer in this second part of my presentation to these three papers, also because they help me in better understanding two essential elements that I want to work on. On the one hand, what means building, creating a Markov blanket, so creating the artifact itself, and on the other hand, the idea of creativity. It is essential in design, the idea of being creative. You don't just make something. You have to create something new. You have to be creative. This is implicit in any kind of, in any conception of design. Now, let me start from this paper. In this paper, Beck and Ramstead develop an unsupervised dynamic algorithm that detects and classifies statistical boundaries in high-dimensional dynamical systems, far beyond the classic view of a fixed static Markov blanket. Their method demonstrates that a Markov blanket is not an arbitrary modeling convenience, but an essential feature that distinguishes macroscopic objects in data. It also takes the combinatorial explosion of possible blankets. In a static setting, in fact, the number of candidate boundaries grows dramatically as system components multiply. Now, by embedding a Bayesian attention mechanism that selectively focuses on the most plausible boundary variables, the author reduced the search space and built a robust taxonomy of object types based on boundary statistics. I think that we can apply this idea to design. If Beck and Ramstead algorithm let us detect an already existing boundary, then by reversing that process, a designer can create a new one. In other words, because Beck and Ramstead show how an agent can infer which elements form a blanket, we can invert their framework to ask, how might a designer actively forge a new statistical boundary within a complex system? In Beck and Ramstead detection algorithm, one alternates between two basic processes. On the one hand, we have the process of inferring blanket membership. This means assigning each microscopic element the label internal, boundary, or external, according to which configuration best explains the observed dynamics, the data. The second process is refining the generative model so that those assignments remain self-consistent on a macro level. Now, to reverse this process, a designer embeds focused priors in the generative model that give high probability to a chosen subset of elements as the future blanket. Rather than simply observing, the designer plans and executes targeted interventions, such as rewiring connections, toggling sensors, or rearranging spatial relationship, to drive the system towards label configurations that satisfy these priors. Therefore, each intervention is selected by evaluating its expected free energy minimization, actions that promise both epistemic clarity about the emerging boundary and pragmatic progress towards its realization are favored. As the designer's intervention reshape the system, A directed Bayesian attention mechanism continually concentrates computational effort on the candidate boundary variables, refining their assignments in light of new observation. So as you can see, in the Beck Ramstead model, we have basically observed data, labeling and updating the generative model, and then the attention, thanks to the Bayesian attention mechanism, we can concentrate on a specific blanket. In the inversion of this model, we designed a blanket. So we established some priors on blankets variables and actions. We update and apply the Bayesian attention mechanism, and then we can establish the new blanket. But does this explain entirely the act of design? As I said beforehand, a few minutes ago, it is essential in design creating something new. Design, the act of designing something creative. We have to create something new. And how can we, I mean, from an active inference point of view, this means, this is the question, how does the designer establish their priors and transport their generative model? This is what we can call in design the ideation phase, the ability to create something new, to develop new models of the reality. Now, creating a new Markov blanket requires generating new priors and thus a new generative model for the designer. This can be understood as a form of structural learning. I refer here to this paper, Smith et al. 2020, because I think they offer a specific solution to think about structural learning, which fits the idea of design very well. Indeed, in the author of this paper define an active inference-based model of structural learning grounded in the idea that a generative model can be equipped with extra slots, that is, undefined priors that can be deployed whenever the agent encounters or imagines new observations, concepts, objects, actions, and so on. In other words, according to this paper, to allow new observation concepts or actions to emerge, the generative model must expand by acquiring new variables that initially carry no semantic content. The empty slots start with a uniform distribution over all possible observation and remain inert until the agent encounters feature patterns that existing concept cannot explain. At that point, empty slots can be used to entertain new hypotheses, to develop new hypotheses about the hidden causes. Each empty slot is gradually shaped by incoming data. This expansion phase is followed by a reduction phase. The slots created may be too many, incomplete, or ultimately redundant. So we have to select, we have to choose which slots, which priors are more useful in that specific situation. Now, I propose to use these two different models, Beck Ramstead algorithm and the model of structural learning presented by Smith, to describe and explain the 5 classic phases we can distinguish in any kind of design process: research, analysis, strategy, ideation, design, prototype, and testing. I propose to frame these phases as iterative cycles of expansion and reduction of the designer's generative model, all aimed at creating a new Markov blanket, the artifact, along with its own generative model, the artifact's functions, which depend on the designer's generative model. Consequently, in this case, the empty slots apply to the blanket labels as well as to the actions needed to actively embed those labels. So research and analysis map to the extension of the existing generative model via empty slots, whereas ideation and design phases correspond to the reductive phase, in which the designer must decide precisely which product to bring into being. We can then embed the Beck Ramstead model into the one proposed by Smith, the structural learning model. Each design phase corresponds to multiple processes of defining and redefining the Markov blanket. We have long timescale, the design phase, and short timescale, the Markov blanket detection. The designer first opens new flat prior slots and probes them via small intervention, letting structure learning reveal which labels or action lower the expected free energy. Once a slot proves explanatory, its posterior is converted into a soft prior over blanket membership, biasing boundary formation toward a new label. Finally, the inverted boundary detector drives real-world interventions to realize that specific Markov blanket. And the outcome either confirms the prior, or it can also send us back to expand or adjust some slots in the designer's generative model. Once the Markov blanket and the generative model are specified, then we can model the artifact's behaviors in terms of free energy minimization or co-minimization. The real challenge here is that once the artifact leaves the prototype and testing phase and enters daily use, the user effectively becomes another designer, able to modify the artifact and develop it in new directions. So, as you can see, we have a kind of a closed loop. Expand, open slots for possible labels actions. Select, some slots gain support from the data, they become soft priors. Soft priors of the designer generative model. Realize we invert Beck Ramstead model. Intervention plus focused attention materialize the blanket consistent with those priors. Those priors concern labels and actions also. And then evaluate if the conditional independencies, the Markov blanket proposed in this case, don't hold under intervention. We go back to expand or reduce the designer generative model. So we reset slots or formulate or reformulate the priors. So as you can see, creating Markov blankets doesn't mean drawing some metaphysical object. It means designing or redesigning a system so that there's a stable inferential boundary between the system inside and the outside. And all influences must pass through a specific set of boundary variables, the blanket, and the informational channel. In practice, it's a design method guided by networks of self-evidencing agents and conditional independencies. Now, I just want to finish with this example. This is a more technical paper, just to give you an idea of how technology can shape Markov blankets. This paper is about a new visualization technique for earth surgery. Basically, they developed this kind of technique to create an hologram, visualization with which you can interact based on real-time data from the biological earth, of course. What's the point here? Basically, the surgeon can interact directly with this visualization, this hologram. It can get real-time data about the biological earth. And this is very useful because the surgeon can plan intervention, the surgery much better. He can better understand the issues, and therefore he can also gain more precision and knowledge about certain other aspect of the Earth. Now, this is particularly interesting because it can be described in this way. There is an inner biological Markov blanket, which is the Markov blanket of the Earth, the biological organ, internal states, external states, and then the blanket, sensory and active states. This visualization technique is able to create a kind of holographic Markov blanket that completely surround the biological Markov blanket, and the surgeon is able to reduce uncertainty relatively to their generative model, interacting with the holographic Markov blanket. The holographic Markov blanket completely shields the biological Markov blanket. The surgeon interacts only with the holographic Markov blanket. Therefore, the holographic Markov blanket, in this case, radically changes all the informational channels in this situation about the Earth. From the point of view of the surgeon, the Markov blanket of the Earth, it's actually the holographic Markov blanket and not the biological one. That's it. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Luca. Such a pleasure. Now, as is the custom, we will briefly unmute our microphones and give you a round of applause. Thank you. Okay, now we will have some time for group discussion and questions, and I will moderate, so I'll keep an eye on the chat. Anyone can raise their hand or write in the chat if they want to ask a question or raise a comment. And I have a long list of thoughts from a fascinating and quite thought-provoking presentation. But I can see that there are plenty of other questions also. So Andreas, you were first.
Yes, thank you for your talk. Lots to think about. And I think a lot of your ideas are really fertile, starting, let's say, with the weak and the strong distinction about agency. But I wonder if active inference is always serving you in this case, or at least I think it's a bit one-sided how you talk about the Markov blanket. So I think there's another side that should get equal merit. Like when you talk about like there's support from the data, right? What's that whole data world? Or you talk about a common filter. So a common filter has an internal model, theoretically, but it also gets measurements from the outside. And it's steering between those two. One test bed for your ideas is linguistic cases. So for example, in Lithuanian, and I think in Proto-Indo-European, for 5,000 years, there's 6 cases, and 3 of them have the will be direct. So like X is doing something for Y in some context, and it's all direct. But 3 of them are indirect. So you have an instrumental case where the will is outside. And I think the will is outside of X, the will is outside of Y, the will is outside of the context. There's a location. And so that's an ancient distinction. And just even if you can, in whatever language, but like show, like how does a person, why are they switching from one to the other? And why would be large language models doing that, etc. So I think maybe just to conclude the thought is that like I'm studying the math of active inference. And when I tease it out, it's just surprising things I noticed that Markov blankets just are really not related to the free energy principle. The only thing there is in the free energy principle, you have a distinction between X and Y. So Y is evidence, X is state, possibly an action. You have distinction between, let's say, P and Q, 2 probability distributions, which presumably are like 2 systems in dialogue, you see. So one with evidence, one without evidence, that's compressed. So when you just say Markov blanket, if you thought of a critique, if you thought of a critic of active inference, you know, I don't know if they would really feel getting the benefits you're like if you balance those. I think there's problems the way active inference does it. I think if you could figure out that balance better. So that's where I'm coming from.
I answer immediately, or I mean, it's honestly, I don't have an answer, but it's more a remark, my thoughts on what you said, which is very interesting, actually. Well, I don't know, honestly, because I always see active inference basically has. I'm not a mathematician, I'm not a physicist, but I see active inference has physics with boundaries, basically. So the principle of least action, for example, with boundaries. So those boundaries, I interpret those boundaries as Markov blankets in the sense that we have a specific informational architecture. You can call it as you want, as you prefer. We have a specific informational architecture, and this is really what characterizes active inference, because otherwise we are talking about something else. But of course, I'm interested in what you said, because actually, if I understood correctly, you are criticizing exactly this point, that Markov blankets are not necessary in order to formulate active inference.
Well, you know, I'll let other people speak, but just to say, like, when you talk about those boundaries, in whose mind are those boundaries? Okay, so I give boundaries to the rock. Does that mean the rock has boundaries? I don't know. That's the kind of question.
This is specifically the point I wanted, one of the points I wanted to raise, in the sense that we are talking about this is an ontological question, in the sense that are these blankets something real, or is just some kind of the way we describe something? And so you have your point of view, I have my point of view, so it's all in our mind. I think that, for example, Beck Ramstead model, but also another paper I mentioned during my presentations, Active Inference 2022, they show exactly the opposite, that Markov blankets are not just a kind of sticker we can stick on everything, because this is one of the classical objections to the free energy principle and active inference. We can just describe anything as a Markov blanket. So what's the point? But I don't think this is the case, and this is why during my presentation I also used the term physically meaningful Markov blankets. We can see clearly, thanks to the techniques described by Beck Ramstead and Active Inference, that Markov blankets are specific property of complex systems that we can identify based on a specific generative model, but they are not something that can be reduced just to a way of describing something. But of course, I think this is more a philosophical question. In the active inference literature, there is the distinction between Markov blankets and Friston blankets, basically. So epistemological or ontological blankets, but I don't know. It's a philosophical assumption, I think.
I see that Elliot has his hand raised, but I also saw Maxwell raised his hand, and I thought maybe Maxwell had a point specifically to this. If so, maybe
yeah, I mean, I imagine that Carl will get into it, so I didn't want to get into it too much. But I mean, the entire formalism of the free energy principle depends on the presence of a Markov blanket. It's not like this optional thing. In fact, like the difference between, you know, more standard non-equilibrium thermodynamics, like, you know, Jeremy England style dissipative adaptation and this kind of thing, and the free energy principle is the explicit postulation or modeling of blankets. I was a bit confused at the idea that boundaries exist in the mind. especially since the algorithm that we've developed is a data-driven way of detecting the presence of these boundaries. So, I mean, the body certainly cares that there is a boundary and an inside and an outside. There are even distinct cell types that line, your skin and your gut versus, cells that are internal to your body. So, yeah, I really don't think that this is, just a like an epistemological postulate. The other quick thing I wanted to point out is that, and this is one of the things that Carl and I responded in the context of that BBS paper. The distinction between Friston blankets and so-called and Markov blankets is just the domain of application. So the Markov blanket just generically, like what they call in that paper, I think unhelpfully, the Pearl blanket is really just applying Markov blankets in the context of graphical inference schemes, whereas the Friston blanket is so-called is just applying the very same construct in the context of not directed acyclical graphs, but these kind of cyclical dynamic non-equilibrium systems. So yeah, just a quick interjection there. Luca, I really enjoyed your presentation. By the way, we've been exchanging a lot, so I'll what I think. I'll abstain from commenting any further.
But I have just a quick follow-up, and
Sure.
I would like to know what you think about this, because for me, one question, a very important question is, okay, we have Markov blankets and active inference and a free energy principle, but do the presence of Markov blankets implies the presence of a generative model, even a basic generative model? I think this is the real distinction between what you say just a few minutes ago, the distinction between Pearl blankets and Friston blankets. Pearl blankets are just a statistical concept, and they do not imply anything else. So you can't base agency on Pearl blankets.
Well, in either case, the Markov blankets live in your generative model. So remember, the generative model is just a model that we as modelers write down to capture the dependencies in the system. So if you're trying to model a system using more kind of standard, directed acyclic graph type things, then you will have Markov blankets in your model. I mean, that's just the minimal set of nodes that you need to consider to compute updates to a given node will be that specific blanket. But in another context where you're not considering directed acyclic graphs, but rather this kind of circular structure, this re-entrant kind of structure that is described by the cycle of act, update, act, perceive, update, act, perceive, update, like that. That's just another application of the very same mathematical apparatus. I mean, in effect, the Markov blanket just arises by saying, well, the dynamics of the system that I'm considering have this specific sparseness structure, where things just affect each other, but vicariously through the set of states that distinguish but couple a system from another. So, yeah.
I think, look, if you were asking, can you have a Markov blanketed system that does not imply that system having a generative model of its environment? Is that your question also? So one thing is that...
My question was, does just the presence of a Markov blankets imply the existence, the presence of a generative model?
And as Maxwell said, Markov blankets are in our models of the world.
Yeah.
But I suppose you also mean, given that I've detected a Markov blanket around this cell, or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
That cell have a generative model of its environment.
Yeah. But I think, from a conceptual point of view, this is my idea. It is implied if we use Markov blanket as a way of describing physical systems, complex system, it implies the idea of a generative model because, I mean, it's a way to run the cyclical causality implied by the Markov blanket itself.
Yeah, I think you're... Elliot, you had a question before I rudely...
Well, I want to get to that, but I also, I share Luca's kind of presumption that a Markov blanket implies a generative model, but my understanding is that the kind of limit case, the kind of trivial generative model essentially yields the principle of least action. Is that right? Like for the rock, for instance. Right?
For the rock?
Right. The rock has essentially a null generative model, and so you get this kind of standard causal physics out of it. And then because, and you can kind of get a sense of, maybe you could characterize like what properties of that kind of Markov blanket make the model trivial. And then up from there, the more kind of complex states, the more complex kind of models are on that spectrum, but it does have a null value.
I mean, I think it depends on the architecture of Markov blankets. In the case of the rock, there are no active states. So basically, the generative model of a rock is, it coincides with physical laws, basically. But this doesn't mean that, if I understood correctly, we cannot hypothesize that the internal states of the rock minimize free energy, even if the rock is not able to manifest it. So we cannot observe the behavior of a rock because the rock has no behavior. So we cannot, how to say, demonstrate based on its behavior the presence of free energy minimization. That's why it has a very basic model of self-evidencing.
Right. But then, a thermostat would have, a trivially active state or something. Right?
Yeah.
Well, if you think about a rock, though, the way to, I mean, you would just consider the lattice, the atomic lattice of the rock. Like, it's not, you know what I mean? You would just look at the physics, If
right. It's a non-strange particle.
It's
a very inert particle. That's right.
But a rock is still but a rock is still it's a lattice of atoms that are constructed in a certain way. Like you can't just ignore that. Like,
but I think that
like sure. Like it is a rock, absolutely. But you have to also, it's important to recognize the underlying, I guess, fundamental, like we get down to brass tacks of what we're talking about here, right? Like where the buck stops at the atoms, at the electromagnetism, right? That by which all these things come up.
But I think the point is how to make sense of our experience of the rock. The point is not the rock itself, in the sense that the point is how we, the observers of the rock, can make sense of what we're seeing. So we don't see atoms, so we don't see that kind of scale of observation. We see a rock, and we can make sense of the rock just basically applying a certain kind of Markov blanket and then hypothesizing a certain kind of free energy minimization, which is just internal. This is the point, I think.
Right.
So you have to consider the level of description.
Of course. So with respect to like the human brain, right? The human brain is made out like the physics that's going on inside of the human brain is a lot more going on, which is why we come up with these kind of things, right?
Right. Maybe I can segue into my question from here, because I wanted to say thank you so much, Luca. I love that you have a philosophy and sociology of technology approach, and that's certainly, that's some of the tool set that I draw from in my research. I've seen that kind of the connection between kind of post-human approaches and the potential for the kind of decentering of the human that's implicit in active inference. But I haven't seen anybody really talk about that. So I'm excited to see this talk. And, to get us from rocks to there, right? I mean, you go from, a rock to, an oscillator in a watch, right? A quartz crystal with piezoelectric effects and things like that. What's what's the boundary between the inertness and then the technical artifact that you're talking about, technological artifact that you're talking about. My work, I'm come from information studies, and so I've asked the question of like, when does like information make things true? And I've also taken this kind of definition of information, amongst other things, right, is expressed as an artifact, as a material inscription, and then looking at the question of truth from a social ontology perspective, using a particular work of John Searle. But a lot of this was informed by kind of before I got into active inference, and so I'm interested in kind of hearing. I used Karen Barad's agential realism as an inspiration. It's one of the new materialisms that you talked about. But in asking, okay, what makes an artifact an agent? That in my account of kind of how information can make things true, like my social security number or whether I'm on the no-fly list, right? You can model that in terms of somebody, making an entry into a database, and then somebody, letting you or not letting you onto the plane, or some system kind of querying the database and letting you or not letting you log in somewhere. The agents, whether they're human or not, kind of doesn't matter. You can kind of look at the reference to those material, kind of the informational aspects of the technology, and see how what happens flows kind of from that. So are information technologies kind of different in kind from the kinds that you're talking about? I'm interested in ways that, like, if I have the ability to put someone on the no-fly list, then I'm not the one who doesn't let them get on the plane. The border control agents do that, right? There's this distributed agency. And so identifying the agent really comes into question. And so philosophers and sociologists and critical theorists, right, do have experience. Latour is a great example of all of these different frames and kind of being okay with this ontological multiplicity of not needing to know or not needing to fix, okay, this is that. It's kind of being able to take multiple perspectives and assemble an understanding from that. So just for the main kind of sentiment I wanted to express is, yes, please, more of this, right? More of this engagement between these communities, because it's incredibly fruitful. But then from there, when you look at that transition from artifact to agent or from non-agent to agent, does information play into it at all? Or do you think that that would be a subset of what you've been working on?
Well, thank you for this question. Well, I don't have just one answer, honestly. I thought it was active inference could be very, very useful, and not just as a new kind of jargon to reframe some concept in the philosophy of technology or sociology of technology, but it could be very useful to reformulate certain questions and concepts in these fields, as I mentioned during my presentation. So it's not just a way of reframe, a linguistic way of reframing certain ideas with a different language, but it's really a kind of, as I said at the beginning of my presentation, a new methodological approach. And I think that I am particularly intrigued by the idea of architectures of Markov blankets, because I think that one of the very interesting aspects of the concept of Markov blankets is that it doesn't necessarily coincide with a material boundary. That's the point. So it's a statistical boundary, a set of conditional independencies, it's an informational flows, but it does not necessarily coincide with a material boundary. That's what allows us to talk about architectures of Markov blankets. And I think this is particularly useful when we want to describe large socio-technical systems. For example, WhatsApp. WhatsApp, it's a very useful case, because you have WhatsApp can be seen as a conservative particle, but also as a dissipative particle. It's much more complicated, but you can also connect WhatsApp to something else, to another socio-technical system, and describe their agency in a different way. And maybe they have a process of free energy co-minimization that are different from other socio-technical systems. So, okay, it's a new language, but it's also a new methodological approach. Then, if I understood correctly, the sense of the meaning of your question, basically, what's the point here? What is the scope of all this?
Well, yeah, maybe what's the scope? I get the point. I'm on board.
Okay. Okay. Fine.
So we're
Yeah,
unfortunately.
I mean, right. Does technology, what's the relationship between technology and information systems, and, you know, or specific systems? Like you mentioned robotics, that it's not about specifically robotics, but I'm a social scientist of robotics. And actually the framework I haven't been using, of course, right? But this kind of participatory observation, ethnography of human-robot interaction, I can characterize some of what I've been doing, right, as helping roboticists understand people so they can help robots understand people, specifically in like a pedestrian, right? And so like I think I could kind of probably articulate some of the activities in robotics as designing a Markov blanket in your sense, and I think that would be very interesting, and it would kind of go from the social into the technical very seamlessly. So that seems like scope. Right,
that was my idea. I mean, being very operative, my idea was creating and developing algorithms for designers based on active inference, so integrating already existing algorithm for designers. This also, I think, can be very useful in the psychology of technology, because we can use active inference to better understand pathologies connected to technologies. For example, addiction to smartphones, this kind of things.
We're running. Sorry to interrupt. This is fascinating.
No, it's okay.
But I just said we're running a little short on time, and I wanted to make sure that Ian also had time for a question or a comment before we hand over to Carl. But if you want, you can reach out to me to get each other's emails if you don't have it already, Ian, because it sounds like there's plenty to talk about. Ian Cover, do you have a question or comment?
So in this model of agency, in what sense is it ethically neutral?
Okay, in what sense is ethically neutral, if I understood correctly?
Yes, I'm not sure I quite understood what you meant.
Yeah, basically my point is that active inference can give us a basic model of agency, which is not necessarily connected to a specific ethical framework, which is not connected to a way of framing agency in ethical terms. That's what I mean. And this is particularly relevant, I think, for technology studies, because, for example, today in artificial intelligence, we talk a lot about design based on ethics. Design must be based on ethics. This implicitly conveys the idea of an anthropocentric design. So basically, design must be based on ethics. Ethics must be based on humans, basically. Humans have to decide and to select the values according to which we have to behave, and systems and artifacts must behave. The problem is that, as I said at the beginning, this means not recognizing, overlooking the agency of technology. How technology can actively does influence our behavior, our habits, our disposition, and also our ethics. I think that active inference is quite useful because it gives us basically a model of agency which does not necessarily imply ethics. This doesn't mean that it cannot include ethics in a further stage. I don't know if it's clear.
So what I'm noticing is, okay, yes, our environment that is obviously shaped by technology will affect how we further engage with the environment and technology.
Yes.
I'm not so sure that it's possible to remove the question of ethics in the sense that technology is designed by humans originally, and it was always our ethical frameworks have been embedded into how we've constructed these systems. So I understand decentering humans in the sense that we are not fully agential in the sense that we're independent. But yes, I see clarity in this.
No, I mean, this is quite interesting because actually assuming a known human, non-anthropocentric model of agency means the ability at least to take some distance from your ethical presuppositions and biases.
And what ethical framework would you tie that to?
Sorry, what ethical frameworks?
Well, is that not in and of itself an ethical framework to be in the world?
Oh my God, this is a big question.
As a human.
I have to think about it. Honestly, I don't have an answer.
Thank you.
So we should thanks for the question, Ian. We should pass soon to Carl, but I do see that Jalin briefly asks if we have a definition of agency in this context, or how agency is meant here, and that might be nice.
Well, basically, how to say, the architecture of my presentation, the starting point was active inference gives us a basic definition of agency, which is self-evidencing. And this implies the idea of Markov blankets. So, and generative models, of course. But I think that this is very interesting, the idea of a spectrum.
Yeah. And that's maybe slightly different from the agency.
I mean, we can also consider agency as an intentionality. This is what you mean.
Yeah, but you were saying in actor network theory.
Yeah,
just because they shape each other, and that's maybe a
oh, you mean agency in actor network theory? Yeah, in actor network theory, these scholars have a very broad definition of agency. Agency as the ability of an agent, can be human or non-human, to influence its environment, basically, and other agents, of course.
Yeah. Okay, thank you, Luca.
Thank you so much.
On all of this, and I have a long list of questions, but maybe I'll get a chance to ask them some other time, because I think
as you wish
to pass on to make it Carl's turn, and Carl, I can push a little bit, so some 20 minutes or something is fine from my side.
Right. So when do you have to go?
10 minutes past 5 or so.
Oh, right, but it's only, we've got an hour or so.
Oh, I'm sorry, the time difference confuses me.
Oh, I see. You've got to leave at 4 o'clock. I see. Right, Mike. I see.
What? Yeah.
Okay. Right. Okay. Sorry, I was going to suggest you ask a question, but I didn't realize that you were we were an hour out. Your 5 o'clock is, of course,
we could also say that I get to ask my question, and then you will have to finish without me. What do you prefer?
Okay. Yeah. You ask your question. Yeah.
Okay. One of them at least. Okay. Thank you. So let's see my list here. Well, firstly, it's just exciting to take the Jeff Beck and Maxwell Ramstead's method there and use it to not just detect Markov blankets, but find out how to intervene in a system so that they come about. And
I don't think it is plausible, but
technically speaking, I imagine that it's not so easy in many situations. But I'm sure we could set up also toy simulations.
That I would be very interested in.
Yeah, because in a sense, the designer is now doing active inference on the artifact by picking actions that makes the artifact to come about in a way that they want,
Yeah.
which they want that to be a Markov blanket. But also, I suppose, because you don't, and this is the question, you don't just want there to be a blanket. You also want there to be the kind of blanket that results in the kind of generative model that produces the kind of behavior that you want.
Yeah.
So there's one question to if you have thoughts on how to extend beyond just creating blankets, but also creating the kinds of blankets you want. My intuition is something like a theory of mind approach, where you include in my model someone else's model. That's my intuition. But Carl has before said that often explicit theory of mind is not important. So maybe a discussion on this.
Yeah, thanks.
And then there's a tiny note on that. Because you have one situation where you were creating some artifact outside of you with its own blanket that produces its own actions, like a technological system, a robot, for example. But you also had a lot of these examples where people use artifacts to mediate their interaction with the environment, like the hammer or VR glasses and so on, where really the artifact becomes your blanket now. And so you have this blanket fusion. And I work with partner dancers dancing tango together. And they're exactly what people will say is that they treat the partner as if they were just part of their body.
Yeah.
They move the partner's leg. They don't communicate, they just move them. So the question is not just designing Markov blankets, but also the generative models, and also designing blankets where you are part of them. Is that different from designing blankets outside of you? Thank you.
Thank you so much for no. This is very fascinating, and I have to think more about this. Concerning the first point, if I understood correctly, basically my idea was okay. The generative model of the designer, which is developed through all the 5 phases of the design process I described. Basically, we can establish, the designer is able to establish not just the boundary, but also the generative model connected to those boundaries. And I think this is quite interesting also from a conceptual point of view, because it gives us the ability to distinguish the artifact and its function, because we have the Markov blanket, the artifacts, and the generative model, which is about the functions. This is very important also in the philosophy of technology, because this is what we call multi-stability. The basic fact that an artifact can be used in different ways, the same artifact in different social contexts, but also by different persons. So I can use my piano, it's always the same piano, but I use it in maybe in a completely different way from another person. And so you have a Markov blanket, but you have also many different, I would say a space of generative models, of possible generative models. This is also interesting because you can see how you mentioned a theory of mind. Of course, the designer built a Markov blanket and a generative model thinking about the user. It has a model of the user in its generative model, because the idea is, okay, I build an artifact and it has to be used in this way. So this is even much more interesting. The artifacts must be a sort of synchronizer between the generative model of the designer and the generative model of the user. And we have a good technological development. The artifacts is used in a proper way when there is a kind of perfect synchronization between their generative models. But there are many different possible scenarios because, yes.
I also, because I suppose there's the designer's generative model, the user's generative model, and the artifact's generative model.
Exactly.
And I guess, so there's actually 3-way synchronization.
Yeah, it's a kind of three-agent synchronization.
And I suppose that the designer must do theory of mind on the user, but also on the artifact, in the sense that they include the artifact's generative model in their generative.
In its generative model, basically, yes, it includes the artifact in the generative model about the generative model of the user. And the user is able to use the artifact if he's able to basically reconstruct the generative model of the designer through the artifact generative model. So it's a complex form of interaction, but it's also, as you said, the artifact can also be seen as an interface, as the Markov blanket in itself.
Between this.
You mentioned the idea of for example, Google Glasses. Google Glasses are an interface that can be seen as active states, sensory states, but also the example, the case I raised at the end of my presentation, the holographic Markov blanket. Technology can literally shape Markov blankets and create nested Markov blankets that can interact with other Markov blankets. And yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about. It's there are multiple kind of possibilities.
It's very exciting, and I'll look forward to hearing what comes of this this work in the future also. Yeah.
And I just want to say again, like this is potentially a way to make someone like Wendy Chun, right? She has this theoretical work around how user interfaces, reproduce the neoliberal subjectivity, right? And you have a formalism potentially, right, that could state that in a way that a scientist might understand without getting into media studies, right? It's just kind of like we encounter these technologies that conceptualize us, and sometimes that changes our self-conception. And then we could start to try to connect those dialogues together.
This is even more interesting because, for example, in psychology, we talk about mentalization. Mentalization is the basic idea of understanding, I'm oversimplifying, of course, understanding the intentions, the thought, emotions of the other person. And basically, artifacts can mentalize us. Think about artificial intelligence, think about recommending systems online. They can attribute us a specific kind of mental states. So the problem is that, how can we formalize this from an active inference point of view?
Yeah. Do you, this is my just mini note in the end here. Do you think designers, or how would you think designers can use this in practice? Like you call Steve Jobs and you give him this, and what does he do with
I gave him what?
It's, I don't know, I'm being a bit CC, but if Steve Jobs were to design the new iPhone based on this.
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, as I said beforehand, basically we can, it would be very interesting to develop algorithms for design based on active inference, algorithms that can help the already existing design algorithms. Today, designers use platforms, online platforms, software devices. This kind of active inference-based methodology for design can, I would say, implement and improve these already existing methodologies to better understand the human-technology interaction, and also to better understand certain kind of pathologies connected to technology, I think.
Very exciting. So I think now is probably the time to hand it over to you, Carl. So I'll just say thank you, Luca, for the presentation, and I'll hang around a little. Leave. And I don't know, Carl, if you feel summarizing all of this is easy or not.
Yes, I can summarize that. So it's my turn now, is it?
Indeed.
Yeah,
thank you.
Very good. Yeah, thank you. Wonderful presentation, very thought-provoking. Some of those latter issues I haven't really thought about before, so I can't really summarize those, but just acknowledge that it was an excellent discussion, and that part of the purpose of these meetings is that they are recorded. I hope they are recorded, so that other people can sort of, it's a resource that people can visit and think about. So much of the agenda has already of this meeting has already been fulfilled. But in terms of feedback, there are lots of issues you've spoken about and have discussed. I'm just going to pick up on a few through the lens of the free energy principle that are, I think, relevant to your the motivation for your thesis and some practical implications of committing to the free energy principle or active inference. And it does strike me that, and there are a number of them. One thing which is in effect a direct answer to Peter's last question, which was, how if you gave Steve Jobs access to the mechanics of the free energy principle or active inference, how would it help? I think there is a generic answer to that, and it's been written in a number of ways in the technical theoretical literature, not the philosophy literature, which says that the free energy principle is just offers a description of things that are sustainable in and of themselves. And you can cast it in terms of self-evidencing or active inference and learning, depending upon your taste. So the sustainability and the existential aspects are a consequence of, or put it another way, the inferential aspects and the learning aspects and the adaptivity inherit from just the existence of the thing. However, once you've established that, just gives you an opportunity to turn things on their head, in the sense that you can always describe anything operationally defined as possessing a Markov blanket in terms of its internal states and its active states, maximizing the model evidence. What's the model? It's the generative model owned by the thing in and of itself. So when I talk about a generative model, I am not talking about an epistemological model. How you think the world works. I'm talking about the model from the perspective of the thing itself, whether it's me or the rock or you. And very often we don't know what that generative model is, and we try and reverse engineer it when we're given something else. So we don't know from the rock's perspective or the artifact's perspective or your perspective what your generative model is, but I can infer what it might be, and I can reverse engineer that and therefore describe you in terms of your generative model. And practically that's used quite a lot in terms of an important aspect of the generative model, which are the priors. So I can phenotype this kind of thing in terms of its prior beliefs. So it behaves as if it is self-evidencing under a generative model that I can now quantify and phenotype in terms of a specification of its prior beliefs. Now, I never know that's true, because I'd have to breach the Markov blanket to get inside and to be that thing. So the generative model is private to the thing that's being observed or being measured or being created. However, you can, knowing that there exists this description, this as if description of the behavior of things, you can now turn that on its head and say, though, if you write down your prior preferences and your generative model, and then you just take off-the-shelf message passing and dynamics, which are basically a gradient flow or a minimization of variation-free energy under that specified generative model, then you have a complete specification of optimal behavior under that generative model that can be used not only to do belief updating on the internal states, but also acting upon the world, because it is just the internal states and the active states that can be written as a gradient flow or a minimization of variation-free energy. And that basically says, if you give me an artifact, or if you let me create an artifact that comes along with its sensory states specified, and the way that it couples via the active states to the environment specified, I can now write down a generative model that completely specifies its internal beliefs and updating and self-evidencing on the inside and its action. It'll make the base optimal decisions and recommendations and act upon the world in a way that is as completely specified and is optimal from the point in a way that I can write down. So now Steve Jobs can just write down what he wants his artifact, his iPhone, to do, to be, to self-organize towards the attractor, the pullback attractor, the generative model, however you want to think about this. And then all he has to do is to get some an engineer to now write down the message passing scheme or the dynamics that are for the sensory, the internal states and the active states. So I think that is something that's quite simple, but quite fundamental in terms of why would you bother looking at the free energy principle as a source of practical utility in terms of designing or creating artifacts? Well, it means that there is a Bayes optimal mechanics and a Bayesian mechanics at hand with practical message passing and or dynamics, depending upon whether you're doing it in silico or in soft robotics or memristas. At hand, that means I don't have to worry about the construction of this thing or the internal, the computations. All I have to worry about is writing down the generative model. And that generative model will include, crucially or simply, the kind of things, sensations, that and the latent causes of those sensations that characterize the kind of artifact that I want to build. That doesn't speak to your other big theme, which of course is that what is an artifact? So I've just said you can build something, and you can build something. There is a mechanics and a set of laws and an application of the free energy principle, which means you can just build something that does something that is specified by its attracting set or its generative model. And here are the equations, and here are the mechanics and the calculus that tell you how to do that. So all the heavy lifting has actually been done for you just by appeal to the free energy principle. That does not apply to artifacts, though, because you very carefully set up the problem that the artifact is something that has been created, constructed by you or me, or something with intentions. And I think that's really interesting. And when you were going through that, I was thinking very much from a sort of ecological, psychological perspective, or Gibsonian perspective. It seemed to me that what you were saying was that artifacts are things that have affordance for us. And then I was thinking, well, what does that mean from the point of view of active inference? Well, there are only two kinds of affordance. There's instrumental affordance and epistemic affordance. Technically, the affordance read as a decomposition of the expected free energy that inherits from the basic physics of self-organization of strange things, given that you are a strange thing and I'm a strange thing, then you can sort of put it just into two kinds of affordance. So that basically means an artifact must either enable you to gain information about the world, or it must have some instrumental value in realizing unsurprising or characteristic outcomes. And that, to my mind, is another, if you like, way of this simplifying what the aspiration of an artifact, making an artifact, is by appeal to the free energy principle and active inference. It's you're putting in play an admixture of epistemic and instrumental affordances by writing down the appropriate priors that underwrite the expected free energy. And I was going to, don't bother answering this, but I could say, is a library an artifact? I mean, as I presume it is. And why is an artifact? Well, it's just a source of knowledge. It's an opportunity. It presents the affordances for me to resolve uncertainty. And then I was going to ask, is language an artifact? And I'm not quite so sure about that, because you can actually cast communication and language as direct exchanges between Markov blankets without any intervening Markov blankets, as it were, a bit like your sort of Google Glasses example. Don't worry about that.
I was thinking
you can waste a lot of time worrying about that. But what it does do, I think, is speak to niche construction perspective on design. And of course, you can construe language as through the lens of cultural niche construction. But I think the sort of niche construction perspective, I think, is really useful because that's well rehearsed in the context of active inference and collective inference. And before I forget, you use the word that, what's a good artifact that has the right kind of affordance for the people who I am designing my artifact for? You said it. It's just got to synchronize. It's got to resonate. It's got to fit in the right kind of way to have that kind of affordance. And mathematically, that is entirely licensed by a dynamical systems perspective on joint free energy minimization. So if you take an ensemble of Markov blankets all coupled to each other, so lots of different kinds of things, then the joint free energy minimizing solution is actually is just synchronization or chaos of generalized synchrony, where the blanket states of the entire ensemble on a joint synchronization manifold are now tracing out a dynamic, and that is the free energy minimum. So when you're on that synchronization manifold, you are now you have now minimized everybody. The joint free energy is minimized, and all the constituents, all the individual moment banks within an ensemble. So if you talk about that, the requisite synchronization, you can, as a footnote, just say that this is mathematically and technically the case, in the sense that being on a synchronization manifold in the joint space of multiple Markov blankets, summarizing the behavior and the sensations or the inputs and outputs of everything in question, is the free energy minimizing.
But I have, if I may, I have a question about this. Can we relate this idea of synchronization manifolds, artifacts, users, designers, to the idea also of psychopathology? Can we have bad forms of synchronization?
I think so, absolutely. The reason I pause is that there is something called the complete class theorem, which tells you that for any pair of priors or loss functions and behaviors, there are some other priors that make you Bayes optimal. But of course, that denies so everybody's Bayes optimal, so there can be no Bayesian pathology under the assumption that you can describe me with my kind of priors. But I think you could push back against that and say, well, are those priors apt for the eco-niche or the environment or the external states? And of course, they may not be. And I think that's what you're talking about. So if my prior beliefs are just not right for the ecosystem in which I'm immersed, or the niche in which I'm embedded, then yes, I'm going to not find my free energy minima in relation to another set of priors, and I will therefore find it more difficult to synchronize and to fit in. So I think that is interesting, and indeed you can sort of just nod to computational psychiatry and computational phenotyping as trying to spot or basically characterize psychopathology in terms of odd prior preferences. Ones that just don't particularly fit with the situation at hand, or the people with whom you have to interact, or indeed the artifacts that are available. So yes, you should be able to measure or at least simulate and quantify that kind of pathology through a loss of that synchronization of chaos, a consequent increase in the joint free energy. And indeed, there is in computer science arguments that if you just think about message passing on in silico on a network, if one node in that network, which has its own Markov blanket, so it's a thing and can be described in terms of self-evidencing in its own way, if it fails to, in relation to all the other nodes in that network, minimize its variational free energy efficiently because it's got the wrong kind of priors, and via Landauer's principle, it will also be thermodynamically inefficient and will be literally hot. It'll be consuming more energy. So on a circuit board, if you can spot those parts that are actually too hot, running too hot, you know that they're not fit for purpose, and you can sort of change them or replace them. So there are chip manufacturers who have actually considered this sort of very tight relationship between thermodynamic free energy and variation or information theoretic free energy explicitly in the services, trying to identify the things that don't fit in properly.
Okay.
So that fitting in properly, I think, is at the heart of your argument. It's not just designing an artifact. Sorry, it's not just designing something, it's designing something with the right kind of affordances. And what are the right kind of affordances? Well, it's the things that the affordances that can be recognized and deployed by the ecosystem or the community or the set of users, natural or artificial, that are in place. So again, we come back to this sort of joint synchronization, joint minimization of free energy, which is, I think, sort of at the could be cast in terms of variation niche construction. It could also be cast in terms of co-evolution, both of which would have their sort of variational descriptions, which you can appeal to. Just before I forget, it might be nice just to sort of just come back to this question about is the artifact an agent, and the question about the ethics. It strikes me that you have at hand a very clear answer to that, which you can, I think, also take into current debates about machine consciousness and machine welfare. So I was interested that there was a slight search for a definition of agency towards the end of the discussion, and I must sympathise that I find it difficult to define agency. I think it's easy to define something that's autonomous. So in the spirit of the Strange Things paper, an autonomous system has active states and can therefore influence the environment. And there are many people in computer science and science journalism that would subscribe to that definition of agency, and they would call a thermostat, for example, an agent simply because it can switch on a heater. And that is completely different from the kind of agency that you were speaking towards, which is defined by intentions. And you talked about sort of the bright line between control as inference and planning as inference, and that's a real bright line in engineering. If Maxwell is still here, so he'd call that the difference between sort of merely reflexive active inference, apt to describe, say, homeostasis if you're a biologist or a physiologist, and a more sophisticated, strange kind of active inference that entails posterior beliefs about what you're doing. So that would be, for a physiologist, allostasis, that moves you from control as inference in the thermostat to something that can actually plan and do planning as inference. And of course, as soon as you've got a generative model of the consequences of your action in the future, you have intended outcomes, and they can be epistemic intentions or they can be instrumental intentions, but you have now intentional behavior. So I think you've now got a definition of agency that comes in two flavors. You can be autonomous but non-intentional, like a thermostat, or you can have a more elaborate or sophisticated generative model that is now future pointing and is, and also is private to you because it's your future, because it's conditioned upon your actions, and that would be an intentional kind of agency. So, as the designer, you've now got a choice. Are you going to build an artifact that has an affordance for your user that has or has not intentions?
Well, if I comment very quickly, I think that okay, the definition of agency, of course, it's a very intricate philosophical point, but I think that one of the big point of active inference and the self-evidencing idea is that it gives us space to put all these ideas together, because on the one hand, I think that, I mean, this is what I see in the idea of self-evidencing a minimal form of acting, fulfilling expectations. This doesn't mean necessarily intention, consciousness, unconscious, whatever. But this is the basis I would say in philosophy, we talk about condition of possibility of intentionality. So much more complex Markov blankets, so conservative, strange particles, much more complex ideas of generative models, and therefore intentions, future related plans, controls, all these kind of things. I think it's more a matter of hierarchy. Autonomy is, for example, is present in, as you said, in strange particles, but because there is a shield between internal and active states. This is autonomy, at least from my point of view. And this is autonomous agency. I think this can be good to make more rigorous our idea of agency, also from a philosophical point of view.
Yes, no, I agree entirely. And then if you commit to that, then you can now think about the question, which I imagine is an ethical question. You can build an artifact, and you can build an artifact that has any kind of generative model. And most of the generative models that we currently implicitly design do not have intentions. They just have, they are optimized to have state action policies. So they behave like a thermostat or a large language model. But in principle, you could build a generative model that includes the future of the artifact and the consequences of its actions and put prior preferences into that. So now equip it with true intentions that will be balanced against the epistemic drives if you want to apply active inference to the autonomy of that artifact. So now what you're in a position, I personally don't believe we have this yet, but in principle you could build artifacts with intentions. Now the question is, what are the ethical intentions you should equip this artifact with? And does something that has its own intentions, can it always provide you with the right kind of affordances? Or are we now talking about a different kind of relationship with the artifacts that we can build? Is it now an artifact if it has its own intentions? So, from the point of view of niche construction, I think there is a really exciting argument, and indeed an exciting time ahead for humanity, that for the first time as part of our niche construction, we are now in a position to construct other parts of our niche that have intentionality. And so in principle, now they are now in a position to construct their own artifacts. So we've, then the definition of an artifact starts to get a little bit, is a second order artifact, is an artifact that's constructed, a paperclip factory run by artificial intelligence with intentionality, for example, do these qualify as first order artifacts from the point of view of humans and users? I think there is a really interesting bright line between artifacts that do and do not have intentionality. You seem to be calling the associating intentionality with autonomy, which again I wrestle with that. It's just semantics. From the maths point of view, it is very clear. It's just do or do you not have internal representations of the sufficient statistics of beliefs about what you're doing and what you will do.
Exactly.
Just to sort of try. For completeness, can I just show you the papers that came to mind, just to substantiate some of the points that you were making, the points that I was trying to summarize, if that would help.
Would you mind if I just interjected with a comment question? Hello, Carl. Hope you're well. Two quick things. It occurs to me that, well, first of all, when you're designing an artifact, there's some kind of top effect, as I think Ropsdorf once put it in a paper I think it was with Chris Frith, where, I mean, in some sense, the intentionality of the artifact you would think is correlated with the intentionality of the designer. So there's a kind of, I guess, weird, like, it's almost a spooky action at a distance where, like, by designing this artifact, I'm trying to channel behavior in this direction rather than that direction. So this is even more obvious when we're considering literal niche construction, in the sense of designing a city environment where, why do, at least in North America, for the most part, why do streets meet at right angles? Well, it's to channel behavior in a certain way and to simplify the representation of spatial navigation problems. So I think that's one aspect to consider. And I did want to just quickly add something to your discussion of affordances. In our work on niche construction, we proposed that there's a third form of affordance, which we call deontic affordance, which is basically the value that a policy or an action has just by virtue of being done in a certain environment. So, this is the when in Rome, do as Romans do principle, if you will. The value of doing something just because this is how we do things here. So I wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
You
Carl?
mean
or Luca?
if the artifact is aligned with some kind of dispositional habits of that kind of environment?
Yeah, precisely. So I guess I just wanted to highlight, on the one hand, to the question of where intentions come from for artifacts, we probably need to consider the design process, as you pointed out to me once, Luca, I think. So there is like this, it's not just triangulating between an artifact and a user. There's also like a designer, and then you could even implicate a wider analysis of like socio-technical capital, the capital technico-mimetic machine, and kind of like the broader structures involved there. And the other point was just there is, when we're considering about affordance design, there is an aspect of behavioral conformity that is also, I think, incentivized through affordance structures. So we stop at red lights. In the first instance, there is some kind of utilitarian kind of expected utility aspect, because if we didn't, then we would all crash into each other. But at least when you're learning it, it's just you stop at a red light, and that's what other people do. And you would probably pick up that behavior just like driving around, noticing that this is what other people are doing. So I just wanted to interject before Carl ran us through the literature review.
No, I mean, if I can just a quick follow-up, it's very interesting, as you said, the intentions are injected in the artifacts from the designer, but also from the user perspective. So there is a kind of equilibrium between different groups of intentions, and the artifacts is at the center of this kind of meeting, this kind of interactions.
Absolutely. Carl, I was wondering if that sparked anything in your mind.
Well, yeah, in fact, I had the Deontic cues as one of the papers for further reading, yeah. So it certainly does. But that particular exchange does spark something. It's just a current debate that I have in my world, not directly related to machine consciousness, but more to the sustainability issues in AI and AGI research. So there are a group of people who aspire to be thought leaders that are trying to highlight the dangers of using reinforcement learning as opposed to free energy and self-evidencing as the right way to write down the objective functions for the intentions of artifacts. So if you want to elude the paperclip paradox, paperclip factory paradox, then one way of eluding that is to realize that reinforcement learning, where you just write down your prior preferences in a very unexpressive way, completely denying the belief-based underpinnings of intentionality. So if you have epistemic intentions, if I want to watch the news, I want to go to the library, I want to use my WhatsApp to find out what my friends are doing, that is motivated by information gain or resolution of uncertainty. That is a function of my private beliefs at this moment in time. Now, that's a completely different kind of objective function that underwrites self-evidencing from reinforcement learning. Yeah, making more paperclips, it's not in the right space. It's a wrong calculus to write down prior beliefs that underwrite intentional or goal-directed behavior. So I think there is a strong ethical argument of a very simple-minded, non-philosophical sort in play here. That if we let our community pursue reinforcement learning, that is not sustainable, in many dangerous and intuitive senses. What we need to do is ethically equip all the artifacts that we create with the right objective function, so they're all self-evidencing, and they just want to now basically offer affordances to all their users and seek out those things that have affordance for them. And then we get back to this notion of the joint synchronization manifold and sort of co-evolution. And you can't do that with reinforcement learning. So I think there really is a strong practical issue that, I repeat, is quite current in some debates about the AI hype and large language models, for example, are certainly those that rely upon reinforcement learning, which you can extend to all the debates currently about sort of electronic communication. But that was me wittering, just giving you something that you could presumably write about. But let me show you. The reason I do this is, I repeat, this has been recorded. So if either you or anybody else wanted sort of further reading from the perspective of the free energy principle, I would recommend the following papers. And I've put this one up as the that's not quite what I wanted. I put this one up as actually it's a forerunner. This isn't it, Maxwell, of the of a later paper, but I'm pretty sure that it covers this notion of deontic cues, traffic lights, basically.
Yeah, that's right. This is to your point, Carl. This is a much more refined version of the. There are a number of papers where we discuss this. I think the one that you meant to show is a variational approach to niche construction, which was published in Transactions A, I believe. And then this is probably the most complete account outside of the BBS paper, Thinking Through Other Minds.
And I think a really useful take on sort of a variational synthesis of sort of niche construction and also cultural niche construction, and why it is traffic lights emerge. And you could argue that from a point of view of natural selection, read as Bayesian model selection, that this is an interaction between all the denizens of a particular environment that they share. And deontic cues are one way of externalizing communication and organizing our behavior, just to find this sort of joint free energy minimizing, synchronized, coherent kind of joint behavior in a shared environment. So it was exactly the notion of deontic cues that inspired me to put that up. Another perspective on this sort of variational synthesis of joint free energy minimization is theoretical biology and evolutionary thinking. And this is a paper which shares many of the same co-authors, that looks at co-evolution using exactly the same calculus, the same kind of self-evidencing of Bayesian mechanics that will be applied to niche construction and self-evidencing. The main point of this paper is something which I thought was interesting in relation to your thesis, that you cannot deal with just one set of conspecifics. You have to, what emerges from this is that a sustainable path of evolution with appropriate separation of temporal scales, which means that, means that you have to have lots of different kinds of things, all in synchrony with each other. So, for example, we need plants and animals in order to survive as human beings. You can't just look at the density dynamics and the theoretical biology of one species, say a predator, and another species a prey. You have to put everything into the mix, which, to my mind, is nicely exemplified by the fact that we have the artifacts which we make are very, very simple. They don't have intentions, let's say tools and hand axes in the evolutionary perspective. They don't have the same, they're not the same kind of thing as you and me or our children. But we do need these things.
Of course.
And they need us. So I think you made the point earlier on that you know when we make a computer, the computer depends upon the human user for its existence. It has to be maintained, it has to be plugged in, it has to be charged. In another sense, of course, that codependency is actually reciprocated, and that's the point behind variation niche construction. That we actually, in some situations, need the computer to
We need, of course.
so there is this codependency, which I think seems to be a key point or seems to be a key issue in terms of designing the right kinds of things with the right fit to this ecosystem of users that that come along in very, very different flavors. So this was just a mathematical telling of that story from the point of view of theoretical biology. Oh, this was a paper by Peter, but he's gone now. So, but he'll be pleased to see this. I just put this up because of your sort of comments about sort of getting the right scale and having Markov blankets and Markov blankets, and the specific issue being addressed by this paper was can the institution that is a collective of different intentional agents, can the institution in and of itself have a Markov blanket? And if so, can it be read as self-evidencing? And if it can, then what kind of generative model does it have? So this paper is just using numerical analyses to try and address that question. Can the institution, can the family, can the species, can the geopolitical organization, can this in-group in and of itself have a Markov blanket? And a Markov blanket,
Yes.
I should have said this earlier on, because a Markov blanket it's just the inputs and outputs to a system in systems theory. It's just an information bottleneck if you want to cast it in terms of information theory. It's just a holographic screen if you want to think of it in terms of quantum information theory. But the question now comes, and of course, so you're also picking up on something which an important point which you slipped in earlier on about the scale of analysis when talking about a rock. I mean, the state of a rock at the scale that you're talking about, the rock is just its temperature and its position and its size. At that scale, so you don't have to worry about the internal lattice and crystalline structure because you're not looking at the scale that you would need an electron microscope. And of course, if you had an electron microscope, you would have broken the Markov blanket
Sorry if I interrupt you. By scale, you mean the generative model of the observer?
No, I actually mean the scale of the underlying metaphysics, the random dynamical system. So any complex system will have a scale invariant aspect. And that means that the same self-evidencing and Bayesian mechanics are expressed at multiple different scales. And what that basically, one way of looking at that is that you can coarse grain a complex system multiple times and upwards and fine grain it downwards. The same rules apply. And from the point of view of the free energy principle, those rules are simply that there are Markov blankets and that the active and the sensory states can be read as self-evidencing. More generally, the dynamics will be expressed as a gradient flow on the log marginal likelihood, which is just a tautological statement of saying that things change in a way that they are most likely to change. It's that's where the tautological aspect of the free energy principle comes in. So you can pick your scale, and the scale that you pick, you can then apply the free energy principle. But you can pick different scales. So you can actually pick the scale of rocks and what is the state of the state of a rock at a scale in terms of rockiness. Well, it's just basically where is it, how fast it's moving, what's its temperature, what's its shape if you want to get if you want to get more detailed. At a lower scale of sort of an atomic scale, then the rock now is actually constituted by a myriad of Markov blankets with possibly a lattice structure and a really interesting structure. But at the scale of the rock, then then it's likely it has no internal states. I'm getting a bit distracted from my brief summary because I wanted to pose an interesting question to you. A rock may have internal states, but you will never know because the internal states.
In the classical limit, it doesn't matter. Like it's at the scale you're talking. Like you might have internal states, but they're so like in terms of the classical limit, like you know what I mean?
Yeah, well, indeed, the classical limit would actually just focus on the position and the velocity of the rock, and then you get Newton's laws of motion out from. So that's absolutely true. But I was wondering though, what's a black hole? So a black hole, um, you know, it presumably has some internal states, and yet you have no access to it because even the sensory states are not available to the observer. So I know I'm not giving you an answer. I'm just a little thought, a little teaser. What's the difference between an inert rock and a black hole? Anyway, moving on. Where are we? Yes, so this was a nod to the emergence at different scales of Markov blankets that are composed of lots of constituent Markov blankets. And then the interesting question, does the generative model at a higher scale have some isomorphism or inherit some aspects from the generative models of the ensemble at the lower scale, remembering, of course, that there is this generalized synchrony, so there's a degree of sharing of the generative models at the lower level. So this is what this paper exploits. It says that if in an idealized case, all the individuals of, say, a community are now and just interact with each other and then converge upon a shared generative model and therefore evince their dynamics on the synchronization manifold, so they're all mutually predictable. Does that mean that the collective has the same kind of generative model as each of the individuals? So it's a really interesting question. It's not directly relevant to design and artifact construction, but it is, I think, an interesting question that is, to a certain extent, unanswered about generative models at different scales that exist at the same time, but just existing at different scales.
Yeah,
How you get from one scale.
absolutely. I think the relevant question would be how can a generative model at that scale, at the large scale, can change?
Yes. And does it have intentions? Does an institution have intentions? And I think it's a delicate question because, of course, if you go to the scale of the weather or the climate, then it clearly, at that scale, you don't have intentions because you've coarse-grained away all the fine details of the future pointing individuals. So, you and I have intentions, but as members of a population, driving around, do we have intentions? I suppose you could say, well, we vote, and that's an expression of. Anyway, these are things which.
But we could also say that institutions do have, or at least the weather, for example, does not have intentions because it has no future.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's an important point. That if you coarse grain to very, very large scales, you lose a lot of the intrinsic dynamics that underwrite intentionality, and you get back to a Markovian system. So you can write down the weather with just a set of 12 first-order differential equations. There are lots of them, but they're really, really very simple, and they have no intentionality. And that only happens because you've thrown away a lot of the fine, the details at the finer scale, including you and me, of course. What's this? Oh, there we are. What's sorry, this might be the one that Maxwell was referring to.
The previous one, yeah.
Yeah, the previous one. My apologies. Right, so we've got both of those there. So that's quite good. We don't need that.
Actually, that's a third paper. So this, so we had originally drafted these two papers that were supposed to be read together. So the variational approach to niche construction from 2018. That was an interface, actually. And then this is the sequel that I believe was published in Physics of Life Reviews. What this paper does, for those of you who are interested in ecological psychology, is explicitly tie the free energy principle to the affordances framework. So that might be of interest. And just while I have everyone, if anyone is interested in exploring, social, cultural scaffolding and active inference, that's one of my areas of focus. So don't hesitate to reach out. I'm Maxwell. I've been working with Carl for about a decade. So very happy to entertain paper ideas and so on. I'm now for those of you who didn't know, I was focusing on corporate functions in settings where we were industrializing active inference, but I've had the opportunity to now spend most of my time doing research again. So I'm always happy to work with new people. And Luca and I, we've been interacting around specifically these issues. So always excited to meet new folks interested at this intersection. I have a philosophy background as well. For those of you who are like from STS and everything. In another life, I was like a postmodern phenomenologist type. So.
Yeah, we have quite the same background because I'm more
exactly. Yeah, we both fell into the FEP from Freud and stuff. So, yeah, very cool stuff.
I have a background more in psychoanalysis, but yes.
I see. Right. Good. Thank you for that. I thought you were a transcendental idealist, but never mind. So just two more papers to go, and then we'll have a rest and a cup of coffee and a cigarette. So I just put this up here just as a little sort of nuance or twist on the notion of intentionality. In the technical literature, intentionality, when you try and simulate intentionality, has a very specific meaning. It means your prior preferences are written in the space of your latent states. Now, of course, when you're first born, you don't have latent states because you haven't grown your generative model. So there's a fundamental difference between having prior preferences and goals written in the space of observable outcomes, like you need for homeostasis, like I need to be registering this temperature or that temperature, or this blood glucose, that blood glucose, and the kinds of prior preferences that can only be installed after you've built and learned or created or constructed a generative model that includes latent states. So you could actually say that the intentionality we are talking about is not just the kind of reflexive intentions you get in thermostats or reinforcement learning schemes. We're talking about prior beliefs that I should be in this latent state or that latent state that I am inferring. And I've inferred that under a particular generative model that I have inherited, but also have learned by interacting with others. So it's just a little twist on how specific you want intentions to be. And to say there is a technical distinction which speaks to the issue about reinforcement learning versus active inference. The final thing is just one of it's just a nod to my friends in paleoanthropology. So this was if you haven't read it, it's an entertaining treatment of where did hand axes come from as what the best evidence of sort of artifacts, and was this an example of convergent evolution? Or was it an example of one person finding it and then it's slowly disseminating through, transgenerationally? But the main thing that's being pursued by Hector here is how on earth do I, as an observer of somebody who's just invented a hand axe, possibly recognize it if I haven't got a generative model of hand axes? And of course,
that's the point.
Yeah, and I need to recognize it in order to replicate or imitate it and teach it to my children to get that transgenerational aspect in. So there's some really interesting issues about the balance between your epistemics, your sort of curiosity and information seeking imperatives, and avoiding surprises like watching somebody playing with a hand axe. That's frightening. I heard an interesting story about people visiting Bath earlier on today, that after the Romans left, for 500 years, people did not dare go into Bath in the UK because there was hot water there, because it came from the natural springs, and hot water was unnatural and surprising, therefore quite frightening. So they completely avoided Bath for 500 years simply because its innovative use of hot springs by the Romans was just a little bit too surprising and frightening. It induced too much free energy. So it's a really, this sort of anthropological or sort of archaeological perspective, I think is really interesting. So how on earth do you get these designers and these creators and these constructors, and how do they, leave their mark, especially transgenerationally? Anyway, that was the last one on that, and I can now stop. And of course, it's up to me to bring things to a close. So that's good.
So thank you so much. It was very, very interesting. I mean, the last question is how can we recognize something as an artifact? That's the point. This means how can we reconstruct the designer generative model from the user perspective?
Yes, yes.
Which is a problem of synchronization.
Yes, an action observation at its most simple level. Yeah, absolutely. And interestingly, sort of imitation learning in machine learning speaks to this as well. Yeah, it is a hot issue.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're getting distracted again. Thank you very much. So could I ask
you.
everybody to unmute and give Luca a round of applause? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Luca.
Thank you.